Okay, Arnold Toynbee was a British historian who wrote a book called A Study of History. And in this he incorporated very much the idea of civilizations. And he didn't really mention Spengler except to distance himself from Spengler. So, he was implicitly critical of Spengler and was not in any way building on Spengler's ideas. But he nevertheless did have some similarity to Spengler in that he was recognizing that world history is divided into the histories of individual civilizations, and also that each civilization lasted about a millennium in its peak form. And this book was actually published in 12 volumes over the period of 25 years, from the mid-30s to 1961, I think the last volume appeared. And so the whole thing tends to be rather meandering, and his ideas were evolving over that time. And at the end of the book, at the end of this work, he's actually started to doubt what he'd really achieved, whether he'd achieved anything, whether the patterns he thought he was identifying were real. He wondered whether maybe he'd taken the wrong approach to it. So, he began to doubt his own work, but there is also a one-volume edition of it. In fact, there's also an abridgment of it produced by someone else. There's also a one-volume version that he had his name on, which brings the ideas more into compact form. And some possible criticisms of this are that it describes the histories of civilizations in terms of a series of stages that they go through, rather like Spengler. But whereas Spengler used, an organic analogy of spring, summer, autumn and winter, Toynbee stages were at least based ostensibly on his study of the data. So he identifies a series of stages that all civilizations go through. But there's no real driving force that explains exactly how civilizations go through these stages, except that he did have a sort of explanation for what propels civilizations through these stages, which is that challenge and response. So it was when the civilization was challenged by something like climate change or geographical restrictions, or maybe threats from other societies. These challenges led to a response, and that then moved the civilization forward. So there is a driving force, but it's a pretty vague and generic type of driving force. The challenges could be any kind of challenge, and the response could be any kind of response. And now we can draw a chart to show his idea of the overall trajectory of a civilization. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so this is Toynbee's idea of the trajectory of a civilization. Like Danilevsky, like Spengler, he believed that a civilization is a one-shot affair, so it goes up and down. The innovation, though, is that in the disintegration phase, it kind of has some bounces, dead cat bounces of the civilization. But the main phases then are the growth of the civilization to its peak, its flourishing, and then a breakdown when it collapses. And he called this the rout. The civilization was routed. But then there came this point, O'Reilly, when it kind of recovered a bit. And then there was a relapse. It fell apart again. And then another rally and another relapse and another rally. And then a final relapse. And Toynbee talked about there being 3.5 beats in the disintegration phase. So it goes once, twice, 3 times, and then a half. And after that, it's disappeared. One question we might have then is, well, what is actually changing here? What is it that goes up and down? And the general sort of impression from Toynbee's writing is that we talk about something about the vigour of the civilization, or its competence to do things, its orderliness. So at the peak, orderliness, it's very orderly society, there are laws, they're obeyed, people behave themselves. When it breaks down, there's rioting, theft, crime of all kinds. And lastly, prosperity. This might represent, so at its peak, the civilization is very prosperous, very wealthy, seen in magnificent architecture and so forth. When it collapses into squalor and economic misery. Another interpretation, though this is theoretical historian Stephen Blaha, if that's how you pronounce it, he suggests that, well, he calls this the societal level. That is measured on the y-axis here, but that's just a name. What does that mean? Well, he suggests it means things like the strength of the institutions, so things like the government, the police, the church. Are they strong? Are they respected? Are they effective? It also means something to do with social cohesion. Social cohesion. So we're here in the realms of Ibn Khaldun and his idea of asabiya, which goes up and down in the dynastic, in dynasties. We saw that when a dynasty comes in, it has strong asabiya, which decays over time and the dynasty collapses. We're also talking about innovation. So we're talking about creativity, also flexibility. If this whole process is driven by challenge and response, is the civilization able to respond to challenges? Is it flexible enough to come up with ways around problems? And also enterprise. Instead of staying stuck in its ways, coming up with new things, enterprise. So we're really talking about the kinds of things that Spengler again was concerned with, that a civilization, when it's going through its cycle, has the ability to create, to innovate, to bring new things into the world. But once it's reached the end of its winter and moved into his Fellahyn stage, it's then unchanging. Ever after, it's just a subsistence form of life. It's not coming up with anything new. It's not adding anything to the world. So that's what this concept of societal level suggests. and that's what's being measured in Toynbee's chart. And Blaha suggests a mathematical theory for this, that if this societal level is x, then we can write the equation mx double dot plus q x dot plus kx equals 0. We can imagine that if we had, or we should know, if we had mx double dot plus kx equals 0, that could be written as x double dot equals minus k upon mx, which is of the form minus omega squared x, where omega squared is replacing k upon m. And we should remember from the mathematical module and the work we did on simple harmonic oscillators that this is the equation of a simple harmonic oscillator with an angular frequency of omega. But in this case we haven't got quite that. We've got the mx double dot and the kx, but we've got this qx dot term, and this is a damping term, as it's called. So if we had something obeying this equation, we would get a simple harmonic oscillator, a sine wave. But when we add this qx dot term, we get something that does that. It decays, the amplitude of the oscillation decays to 0, and it's this qx dot term that is doing it. It's what it's saying is that there's not only a force pulling it back to the center, but there's also a force that depends upon the speed x dot, so that the faster it's moving, the faster or the greater the opposition to the movement. And so this force that's opposing the movement is not just pulling it back to the center, but it's trying to slow it down. Because it's a negative, if we put it on that side, it's a negative term that's proportional to the speed of movement. So it's trying to slow it down, and that's what causes the oscillation to decay. And so what Blaha has done is notice that this well-known equation with the damping term for a damped simple harmonic oscillator looks very like Toynbee's 3.5 beats here. Now it's not quite the same because this goes up and down below 0, but if we squared it, if that were x, then x squared would indeed look like that. So this seems to be an equation for to describe Toynbee's ideas about the trajectory of a civilization. Now, Blaha doesn't give an explanation for what these M, Q and K are, how we derive them, or what they mean, what they correspond to in reality. He just picks some values for M, Q and K that result in 3.5 beats in 1,000 years. But what he does do is take this general curve for a whole range of civilizations and then try to fit them to particular events in that civilization. So events, so he's plotting the time, the actual time of a civilization, like it might be the Roman Empire from 500 BC to AD 500, and he's plotting the events that happened. You know, that in this period he's showing that Rome made lots of conquests, and here it suffered from lots of barbarian raids and lost territory, and then it fought back, and the empire became a bit more peaceful again, but then it collapsed into internal rioting. So he's fitting events of civilizations to this chart. So he's, in that respect, he's a bit more systematic than Toynbee, who didn't actually draw it like this and didn't try and, you know, quantitatively put events at particular points along the timeline, but talked about it in more qualitative terms as to what was going on in civilizations at particular times. So that's a step forward. But perhaps the problem is, though, that there's a bit of flexibility, leeway in what counts. So if it was, say, in Western civilization, the Battle of Waterloo, is that a great victory for Western civilization or a great defeat? So you could sort of argue each way. If it fits at a peak, you'll say, oh well, the Battle of Waterloo, and you might interpret it in a way that suggests it was a positive thing. But if it occurs at a trough, you say, oh well, the Battle of Waterloo, and interpret it in a way that's a negative thing. So although it is somewhat more scientific and quantitative, there is this issue of, but exactly what are your criteria for suggesting significant events and judging whether they correspond to a positive or a negative. Now, that all said, it shouldn't really be difficult to do that, or it might be a lot of work, but the principle behind it is not so difficult. We know what we've got to do, which is come up with some criteria. If we're saying that are things we're measuring of vigour, competence, orderliness and prosperity, or strength of institutions, social cohesion, we need to come up with some ideas as to how we measure those. And then once we measure those, we can then really test whether things fit this chart, this curve. But that work hasn't been done. But it's, there is definitely a potential there. And what Blaha has done is, a very good start in that direction. Now, Toynbee himself had a theory that explains, if not exactly why it's 3.5 beats or anything, but certainly explains why societies go through this, or how, at least perhaps how, as we mentioned at the beginning. His idea about the drivers is a bit vague about challenge and response, but he certainly has a model of how this process works, which has various moving parts and various dynamical processes. So we'll draw that next. Okay, so here is a diagram of Toynbee's theory explaining how civilizations go through different stages, from coming into existence to disappearing or turning into a stagnant form 1,000 roughly years later. And we had on the previous chart, I showed this curve with these 3.5 beats of disintegration, and I may have forgotten to emphasize that the three key stages of his ideas about the evolution of a civilization are: there's a growth phase to its peak, then the breakdown, and then the disintegration, which takes a long time. So there's a brief flourishing and then a much longer decay, disintegration, with its 3.5 beats. Well, that's what I've put up here. I've just turned this chart on its side, and time is now going downwards. So it rises to its first peak, and then it bounces 3 times until it reaches its end there. And we have here at the beginning of the civilization, it's divided into 2 key groups, according to Toynbee: the population of the civilization, the creative minority, as he calls it, the creative minority, and the internal proletariat. So the creative minority are the elite, what in Gumilyov's theory of ethnogenesis he would call the passionaries, the creative minority, the people with vigour and drive and vision. And the internal proletariat is everyone else: the workers, the soldiers, the raw material of the civilization. And then we notice up here this idea of challenge and response as what gets a civilization started. So there is some challenge, which is kind of vaguely defined what that might be. A challenge which is met by this creative minority, Gumilyov's passionaries, and they come up with some response, and that response is to start to build a civilization, which is quite similar to Gumilyov's ideas, that it's that when there's some problem, the passionaries start off a civilization. They recognize that, hey, we're a group of people who have some common interests here, and that forms the seed of a whole new ethnos, in his view. In Toynbee's ideas, it's a whole new civilization. And then we have, well, this is supposed to show a sort of black squiggle between the two, is that there is conflict. There are different interests between the creative minority and the internal proletariat, and so there is conflict between them. And this conflict eventually leads to a time of troubles. So order collapses or decays within the civilization, and there are rival people bidding for power, civil wars and so on. So a time of troubles also where they're perhaps more vulnerable to outsiders as well, because the internal loss of order creates opportunities for people around the borders to start to seize some territory, do some raiding and so on. So there's this conflict between them leads eventually to this time of troubles. And according to Toynbee, then the creative minority by this stage has lost its creativity, but it is able to restore order to the society through force. And at this point it's become a dominant minority with still the internal proletariat. So now this elite, it's lost its creativity. It's now just ruling for its own benefit, for its own desire for power. But because it's lost creativity, this is why the civilization's never going to recover again. It may bounce a few times, but it's lost all its potential. It only flourishes once. But the creative minority is developed into a dominant minority, which lacks any potential for innovation and further development and growth. And then we have here the concepts of a universal state and a universal church. So what does that mean? Well, according to Toynbee, this remember is happening in a whole civilization which initially is internally diverse. We saw again that Danilevsky emphasized that a civilization has some internal diversity, but what comes out of the time of troubles is an empire that spans the entire civilization. So Toynbee's really thinking about the Roman Empire and how it came out of the struggles that ended the Roman Republic. And so that was a time of troubles. It produced the Roman Empire, which spread through the entire civilization and brought the whole civilization under a single state, the universal state. And at the same time is emerging what he calls as a universal church. So again, in the Roman Empire, or in the Roman world, the Greco-Roman world, the classical world before the Roman Empire, there were many, many deities. Each city had its own local god. But the Christian church was emerging at the same time as the Roman Empire was being founded. So the Christian church was a universal church. Everybody could belong. There was one God. It was a single common faith that spread through the Roman Empire. So again, Toynbee has that in mind, but he's saying that, describing this as a general principle. He found the same kind of development in other civilizations. So there's a universal church comes into existence and a universal state. And he suggests that the ideas that form the universal church, which is kind of developed, where's the dominant minority that was once responsible for founding this universal state, this empire, it's among the internal proletariat, the common people, that the universal church arises. So, you know, the Christians in Rome were initially an outlawed group who were persecuted and thrown to the lions. So it's a common people who develop this universal church, but using ideas that may come from a previous civilization, this dashed line, and this universal church can then go on to influence the next civilization in the same way. So religious ideas can sort of pass from one civilization to this one and then on to the next one. And the other key player in Toynbee's theory is the external proletariat, as he calls it, the barbarians. So, and perhaps calling it the external proletariat is quite similar to some of the ideas of world system theory that we have touched upon, that see the world as divided into a core and a periphery, in the same way that in Marxist theory societies are divided into the elites and the workers. So the external proletariat are the people who are exploited by the civilization. They're the surrounding barbarians who are exploited by the civilization in the same way that the workers are exploited by the elites within the civilization. But anyway, we've got these external proletariat around the civilization, and they are interacting with it. You may recall we mentioned the idea that in the introduction to this lesson, and we will see when we come to it, that the barbarians, the external proletariat, can be seen as the dark twin of the civilization. And they're the dark twin in the sense that they're influenced by it. So the external proletariat acquire the technologies that are developed within the civilization, and they also develop aspirations, so that when they see this civilization, they develop aspirations to bring themselves up to the same level, or to raid the civilization and acquire its wealth, or to infiltrate the civilization and rise to power within the civilization. So they develop aspirations for themselves that are threatening towards the civilization just by being there and looking at it developing. And this then leads to barbarian war bands who come into conflict with the universal state. So again, using the Romans as the model, this is the Germanic barbarians who were trouble, thorn in the side of the Roman Empire for the later centuries of its existence, and who not only attacked it militarily but also infiltrated it, and in later centuries the generals of the Roman army were themselves barbarians. And so that's it. Then there's this, beset by these war bands, and having lost its creativity, it could just fluctuate a few times, but its destination is clear. It's no longer able to develop. It's just going to reach a stagnation.